The crystal chandeliers above me trembled with each footstep of the wealthy mourners, their designer shoes clicking against the marble floors of Vincenzo's ballroom like a countdown to something I couldn't name. I'd been serving champagne and hors d'oeuvres at high society events for 3 years now, but I'd never felt the weight of death pressing down on a room quite like this. The air smelled of roses. Too many roses. Their cloying sweetness, mixed with expensive cologne and the sharp tang of something I couldn't quite identify, danger, maybe, or the particular tension that comes when powerful men gather to bury one of their own. My fingers ached from gripping the silver tray. I'd been on my feet for 6 hours, weaving through clusters of men in $1,000 suits and women draped in black designer dresses that probably cost more than my annual rent. They spoke in hushed tones about the deceased, their voices carrying that particular reverence reserved for the powerful and the feared. Tragic, a woman whispered near me, her diamond earrings catching the light. Doran Moretti, dead at 38. Heart attack, they said. Her companion dabbed at dry eyes with a silk handkerchief. Who would have thought a man like that? I shouldn't have been listening. I was supposed to be invisible. That's what Maggie, my supervisor at Vincenzo's, had drilled into me during training. Serve, smile if necessary, and disappear. We were ghosts in their world, furniture with pulses, nothing more. But something about this funeral felt wrong. Maybe it was the way the men gathered in tight circles, their eyes constantly scanning the room like predators checking for threats. Maybe it was the bulges I'd noticed beneath several suit jackets, guns, I realized with a cold shock. Or maybe it was the casket itself, positioned at the far end of the ballroom like a grotesque centerpiece, surrounded by enough white roses to stock a funeral home for a month. I'd heard whispers about Doran Moretti. Everyone in the service industry had. He owned half the restaurants in the city, they said, though everyone knew that was just the surface. Beneath the legitimate businesses ran rivers of darker enterprise, protection rackets, underground gambling, things people like me didn't speak about if we valued our continued employment. Or our safety. The Moretti family had ruled the city's underworld for 3 generations, and Doran had been their prince, then their king, and now, apparently, their corpse. I moved through the crowd, offering champagne to people who took glasses without seeing my face. My feet throbbed in the cheap heels I'd bought at a discount store, and I could feel a blister forming on my left heel. The black dress I wore, the only formal thing I owned, was starting to stick to my back despite the air conditioning that kept the ballroom at a temperature that probably cost more per hour than I made in a day. Mississippi. A hand touched my elbow, and I turned to find a man with silver hair and eyes like chips of ice staring at me. Victor, I'd heard someone call him. Doran's second in command. Refresh the flowers near the casket, he said, his voice low and controlled. Some of the roses are wilting. I blinked. I'm serving drinks, sir. I'm not. You are now. His voice didn't rise, but something in it made my stomach clench. This wasn't a request. This was the kind of order you didn't refuse, not in a room like this, not from a man like him. I set down my tray on a nearby table with trembling hands and walked toward the casket, my heart hammering against my ribs. The crowd seemed to part around me, and I felt exposed, vulnerable in a way that made my skin prickle with awareness. Every eye in the room could be on me, or none of them. I couldn't tell which was worse. As I approached, I could see the casket more clearly. Rich mahogany with gold handles polished to a mirror shine, the lid open to display the deceased to his mourners. I'd never seen a dead body before. My parents had been cremated after the accident when I was 19, their caskets mercifully closed at the service I'd barely been able to afford on my waitress salary. I didn't know what I expected death to look like. But as I reached the arrangement of white roses and began adjusting the wilting blooms with trembling hands, I couldn't help but look at him. Doran Moretti was beautiful, even in death. That was my first thought, and it came with a wash of shame. You weren't supposed to think such things about a corpse. His face was perfectly composed, skin pale but not gray. Dark hair swept back from a face that could have been carved from marble, all sharp angles and strong lines. He wore a black suit that probably cost more than my car had back when I'd had a car, before it died and I couldn't afford to fix it. His hands were folded over his chest, and even in stillness, there was something powerful about him, something that whispered of command and danger and absolute authority. I reached for a wilting rose, my fingers brushing the smooth petals. And then I froze. Because I saw something impossible, something that made my breath catch in my throat and my heart stop in my chest. Doran Moretti's chest moved. Not the settling of death, not my imagination playing tricks in the dim lighting. A shallow, desperate breath that made his silk tie flutter almost imperceptibly against his chest. His eyelid twitched, just barely, but unmistakably. A tremor ran through his clasped hands. He was alive. My silver tray clattered from my numb fingers before I even realized I'd picked it back up. Crystal exploded against marble like gunfire. The sound shattered the hushed reverence of the room, and 300 heads turned toward me in perfect, terrifying synchronization. The room fell silent. Even breathing seemed to stop. "He's not dead," I heard myself say, my voice cracking, too loud in the sudden quiet. "He's breathing. Look, he's breathing." For one frozen moment, nobody moved. They all just stared at me, this nobody waitress who dared to disrupt the funeral of Doran Moretti. Then Victor was moving toward me with deadly intent, his hand reaching inside his jacket, and I realized I'd just made the biggest mistake of my life. If this were you standing in that room, realizing a man the entire world believed was dead had just taken a breath, what would you have done? Would you have stayed silent, or would you have spoken up like I did? Before we go any further, pause for just a second. Tap like if your heart is still pounding. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, because right now, it feels like all of us are standing in that ballroom together, holding our breath. And if you want to know what happens next, what Victor does, what Doran Moretti becomes when he opens his eyes, and how one waitress's life is about to collide with a world of power, blood, and impossible choices, subscribe. Because Chapter 2? That's when the dead man moves. And nothing is ever the same again. My breath caught in my throat, my hands suspended over the white roses as my eyes locked on Doran Moretti's chest. It moved again. A shallow, desperate rise and fall that made his silk tie flutter almost imperceptibly against the fine fabric of his suit. His eyelid twitched barely there, but unmistakable. A tremor ran through his clasped hands, so subtle I might have missed it if I hadn't been staring directly at them. Dead men don't breathe. The thought echoed in my mind as my heart hammered against my ribs. I must be imagining it. The lighting, the stress, 6 hours on my feet, my brain was playing tricks. It had to be, because the alternative was impossible. But I couldn't look away. I leaned closer, close enough to smell his cologne, something expensive and woody that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Close enough to see the faint shadow of stubble along his jaw. Close enough to see it happen again. His chest rose, fell, rose again. The realization crashed over me like ice water. Doran Moretti was alive. "He's breathing," I whispered, the words barely audible. Then louder, my voice cracking with panic. "He's not dead. He's breathing." The room erupted. Victor reached me in seconds, his hand reaching inside his jacket toward what could only be a weapon. His face was a mask of cold fury. "The girl's hysterical," he snapped at someone behind me. "Remove her. Now." "Wait." The voice belonged to Maggie, my supervisor, who'd pushed through the crowd. She approached the casket, her face draining of all color as she looked down at Doran. "Mother of God," she breathed. "She's right." Her voice rose to a scream. "Call an ambulance, now." Chaos erupted like a bomb had detonated in the center of the ballroom. Half the mourners surged forward toward the casket, shouting questions and demands. The other half bolted for the exits, designer shoes clattering against marble in panicked rhythm. I was shoved hard against a pillar, the impact knocking the air from my lungs. Bodies pressed around me, expensive suits and silk dresses, the smell of perfume and panic. "He has a pulse," someone shouted. A man I hadn't noticed before, a doctor, judging by how quickly he'd taken charge, was bent over the casket, his fingers pressed to Doran's neck. "Weak, but it's there. We need emergency medical." "Already on their way," Victor said, his phone pressed to his ear. His eyes found mine through the chaos, cold and calculating in a way that made my blood freeze. "How?" I thought dimly. How were they already on their way? The funeral was at a private estate. Ambulances didn't just wait around the corner. But then the paramedics were there, rushing in with equipment and urgent efficiency, and I didn't have time to think about the impossibility of their timing. I watched, pressed against the pillar, as they swarmed the casket. Watched as they checked vitals, loaded him onto a gurney, shouted medical terms I didn't understand. Just before they wheeled him toward the door, Doran Moretti's eyes fluttered open. Through the chaos and the crowd, through the shouting and the movement, his gaze found mine. Those dark eyes, alert despite everything, intense even in whatever hell he was trapped in, locked onto my face. Something passed between us at that moment. Recognition, maybe. Or gratitude. Or perhaps something darker, something that made my stomach clench with a fear I couldn't name. Then his eyes closed, and they were taking him away, and I was left standing in a ballroom full of dangerous men who'd just watched me disrupt the funeral of the most feared crime lord in the city. I'd saved his life. And somehow, standing there with Victor's cold gaze still fixed on me, I knew with absolute certainty that I'd just made the biggest mistake of my life. For 2 days, I tried to convince myself that I was safe, that saving Doran Moretti's life had earned me a thank you and nothing more. I was wrong. I'd returned to my studio apartment immediately after the funeral, locked the door, the deadbolt, and the chain. Then I'd stood in my tiny kitchen, staring at the locks like they could actually keep out the kind of people who'd just watched me disrupt their world. The news reports started within hours. "Miracle at Moretti funeral," the headlines screamed. "Mafia boss poisoned." I sat on my second-hand couch, remote clutched in my hand, and watched the story unfold on every channel. Tetrodotoxin. The poison had a name, and learning it made everything worse. The reporters explained it with clinical detachment, a toxin that mimics death so perfectly that victims appear completely lifeless. Heart rate drops to nearly undetectable levels. Breathing becomes imperceptible. But the victim remains conscious, trapped in their own body, aware of everything happening around them. Doran Moretti had been awake in that casket. He'd felt them prepare his body, heard the funeral arrangements, known they were going to bury him alive, and been powerless to stop it. The poison would have worn off eventually, the experts said, but by then he'd have been 6 feet underground, suffocating in silk-lined darkness. Someone had tried to bury him alive, and I was the reason they'd failed. I barely slept those 2 nights. Every car door, every footstep in the hallway outside my apartment made me jump. I'd made enemies I couldn't even identify, people who'd wanted Doran Moretti dead and buried, people who now knew exactly who I was and what I'd done. On the 3rd morning, I woke to the sound of car doors slamming in rapid succession. My studio faced the street, and through the thin curtains, I could see them. 3 black SUVs parked at angles that blocked every exit from my building. Men in dark suits emerged, taking positions with military precision. No sirens. No police. Just efficient, coordinated control. They'd come for me. The knock on my door wasn't aggressive, no pounding, no shouting. Just 3 measured knocks, delivered with absolute certainty that I would answer. I opened the door because running was pointless. Where would I go that they couldn't find me? Victor stood in my doorway, his silver hair perfect despite the early hour. His expression was unreadable, not angry, not sympathetic, just utterly controlled in a way that terrified me more than rage would have. "Mr. Moretti wants to see you," he said simply. "It's not a request." My hands shook as I grabbed my phone, wallet, and keys. Victor's eyes tracked the movement, and I wondered if he thought I might try to call someone. As if anyone could help me now. The ride was silent. Victor sat beside me in the back seat, 2 more men in front. We drove through parts of the city I'd never seen, past gated communities where houses sat behind walls and perfectly manicured lawns, into neighborhoods where the cheapest home probably cost more than I'd earn in a lifetime. The Moretti estate made those houses look modest. 20-foot walls topped with cameras. Armed guards at a gate that looked like it could stop a tank. We passed through security checkpoints that would have made an airport jealous, and then the mansion itself came into view, old-world elegance wrapped in modern paranoia, beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. This was a fortress, and I was being taken inside. The interior matched the exterior, marble halls that echoed with our footsteps, priceless art on walls, crystal chandeliers that probably cost more than my entire apartment building. Victor led me through corridors that seemed designed to disorient, past rooms I glimpsed but couldn't comprehend, until finally we stopped at a heavy wooden door. He opened it without knocking, and there he was. Doran Moretti sat in a leather chair behind an enormous desk, looking like a king on his throne. He was pale, thinner than he'd been in the casket, with shadows under his eyes that spoke of pain and sleepless nights. But he was alive. Undeniably, powerfully alive. His eyes, dark, intense, penetrating, locked onto mine the moment I entered. I felt transparent under that gaze, like he could see every secret I'd ever kept, every lie I'd ever told, every thought I'd ever had. "Sit," he said simply, his voice rough but commanding. I sat. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that my life would never be the same. "You saved my life," Doran Moretti said, his voice rough from intubation, but carrying absolute authority. Martha sat frozen, her mind still reeling from the chaos of the funeral. The man who'd been declared dead mere hours ago now sat, tubes disconnected, his steel-gray eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her stomach flip. Martha tried to find her voice, failed, swallowed hard, then managed, I saw you breathing. And you spoke up. Doran's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. In a room full of dangerous men, you were the only one brave enough, or foolish enough, to tell the truth. Martha wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the warmth of the room. "What happened to you?" "Tetrodotoxin," Doran said, the word falling like a stone. "Administered during a business meeting 2 days before the funeral. The poison slowed my heart to nearly nothing, stopped my breathing, made me appear completely dead to every test they ran." "But you weren't," Martha whispered. "No." His jaw tightened. "I was conscious. I felt them prepare my body. Heard the funeral arrangements. Knew they were going to bury me alive." He leaned forward slightly, his gaze never leaving hers. "Do you understand what that means? Being aware while they discuss your burial plot? Knowing you'll wake up in a coffin 6 feet underground." Martha's hand flew to her mouth as horror crashed over her. The suffocating darkness, the limited air, the absolute helplessness. "The poison would have worn off eventually," Doran continued, his voice hard. "But too late. I'd have suffocated in that coffin, clawing at satin while my lungs burned." "Oh God," Martha breathed. "You think I'm grateful," Doran said, leaning forward. "I am. But gratitude doesn't keep you safe." The shift in his tone sent ice down Martha's spine. "What do you mean?" "Whoever poisoned me knows you're the reason I'm alive." Doran's expression darkened. "There's a traitor in my organization, someone close who orchestrated everything. They had access to me, to my schedule, to the exact moment to strike. I don't understand what that has to do with me. Until I find them, Martha, you're a target." His words were matter-of-fact, delivering a death sentence in the same tone he might discuss the weather. "You're mine now. Under my protection. There's no other option." "No." Martha shook her head, backing toward the door. "I have a life, a job, an apartment." Doran interrupted, his voice cutting through her protests like a knife. "You had those things. Now you have something more dangerous, my attention." Before Martha could respond, Victor appeared beside her. She hadn't even heard him approach, carrying 2 suitcases. Her suitcases. "We've already cleared out your apartment," Doran said. "Everything you own is here. You can't just," Martha's voice cracked. "You can't do this. I already have." The rooms they showed her occupied an entire wing of the mansion. Martha walked through them in a daze. A bedroom suite larger than her entire apartment, a private bathroom with marble everything, a sitting area with furniture that probably cost more than her car. She touched the window, and Victor's voice came from behind her. "Bulletproof glass. Guards stationed in the hallway for 24 hours. Prisoner in paradise. A luxury prison. Don't leave the estate," Victor continued, reciting the rules like a grocery list. "Don't contact anyone outside. Cooperate with security at all times." A woman appeared, middle-aged professional, with kind eyes that didn't match her rigid posture. "I'm Rosa. I'll attend to your needs." Additional surveillance, Martha understood immediately. When they finally left her alone, Martha sank onto the bed, a bed that cost more than a year's salary, and cried. Through her tears, she saw her reflection in the window. Beyond it, armed guards patrolled the grounds with military precision. She'd come to a funeral as invisible help and left as property of the most dangerous man in the city. Somewhere in Doran's organization, a traitor was planning their next move. And Martha was now the bait. Her life wasn't in her hands anymore. 3 weeks passed in strange suspension, where Martha existed between worlds, no longer herself, but not yet whatever Doran Moretti intended her to become. Her days followed a peculiar rhythm. Breakfast arrived on fine china at 8 sharp. Rosa laid out clothes Martha would never have chosen: elegant, expensive, designed to transform a waitress into something else entirely. The rooms were beautiful, the food exquisite, the isolation absolute. But the isolation came with education. Martha began to see the operation hidden beneath the mansion's civilized veneer. Men arrived at all hours, their footsteps echoing through marble halls. Conversations drifted up in Italian and Russian, the cadence of business conducted in shadows. She learned to recognize the different types of visitors, the nervous ones seeking favors, the dangerous ones bringing news, the silent ones who came and left like ghosts. She witnessed Doran at work. Through cracked doors and from balcony overlooks, she saw him in his element, cold, calculating, terrifyingly efficient. Phone calls where his voice dropped to lethal quiet, barely above a whisper, yet somehow more menacing than screaming. Meetings where grown men, hardened criminals themselves, flinched at his displeasure like children caught misbehaving. The violence was implicit but undeniable. People who crossed Doran disappeared. Not dramatically, no gunshots in the night, no bloodstains in the morning. They simply ceased to exist, erased as thoroughly as morning fog. Martha should be terrified. She was terrified. But she was also fascinated. Because unlike every powerful man she'd ever served at the diner, Doran never pretended. He never performed righteousness or played at being civilized. He was exactly what he appeared to be, and there was something almost refreshing in that brutal honesty. The conversations began unexpectedly. The first time, Martha was in the library at midnight, unable to sleep, running her fingers along leather spines of books she'd never imagined owning. She sensed him before she heard him, that particular electricity that preceded Doran Moretti. "What are you reading?" he asked from the doorway. She showed him, Jane Eyre. He smiled, actually smiled. The Mad Woman in the Attic. Appropriate. They talked for an hour. He listened when she spoke, remembered details, asked questions that suggested he actually cared about her answers. It happened again the next night. Then the night after. Martha found herself telling him things she'd never told anyone. Growing up poor in foster care after her parents died in a car accident. Working 3 jobs through community college, the endless, grinding cycle of poverty. How she learned to become invisible by necessity, disappearing into the background to survive the system's cruelty. Invisibility is a skill, Doran said quietly. One I respect. His honesty in return startled her. I'm a criminal, Martha. I've done things that would make you sick. I've hurt people, killed people, destroyed lives. He met her eyes without flinching. But I'm also the only reason you're still alive. In my world, that creates a bond whether you want it or not. He was giving her truth when he could have given comfortable lies. The realization unsettled her more than anything else. Slowly, Martha started to see beyond the monster. Doran's dry humor during tense moments. His exhaustion with the constant threats, the weight of responsibility for hundreds of lives. He showed her scars one evening, the roadmap of violence carved into his skin, telling their stories not to impress, but to explain who he'd become. She witnessed his loyalty to his men, how he personally delivered death benefits to widows, and ensured children of fallen soldiers attended the best schools. The moral complexity disturbed her, vicious to enemies, but fiercely protective of his own. He's never been like this, Rosa confided one afternoon while arranging flowers. Distracted. Almost gentle. One evening, Doran found Martha on the terrace, watching the sunset paint the city gold, his city, the empire he controlled through fear and blood. You're not a prisoner, he said quietly, standing beside her. You can leave if you want. I'll make sure you're protected. But they both knew it was a lie. There was no leaving his world alive. The traitor was still out there, and Martha's face was now known to every dangerous player in the city. More troubling for Martha, she wasn't sure she wanted to leave anymore. The break in the investigation came from an unlikely source, Martha herself. She'd been replaying the funeral obsessively in her mind, examining every moment like picking at a scab. The weight of Doran's body when they'd pulled him from the casket. Maggie's screaming. The chaos of men shouting orders. And something that didn't fit. The paramedics arrived too fast, Martha mentioned one evening, the words tumbling out during dinner. Within minutes, Doran's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. He set it down with careful precision, his entire body going still in that predatory way that made Martha's pulse spike. What do you mean, too fast? The funeral was at a private estate, Martha said, her confidence growing as the pieces clicked together. Miles from the main road. No ambulances were scheduled nearby. Why would they be? But they arrived almost immediately after Maggie called. Doran's eyes had gone cold, flat. Calculating. As if they were already waiting nearby, Martha continued. Prepared for exactly that emergency. The silence stretched like a wire pulled taut. Then Doran's expression transformed into something deadly, something that reminded Martha exactly who she was sitting across from. Someone wanted me found, he said quietly, his voice carrying the promise of violence. Not dead, but saved. I don't understand. The poisoning wasn't meant to kill. Doran stood abruptly, already moving toward his office. It was meant to trigger a specific response. Victor. Within the hour, the mansion transformed into a command center. Victor and Doran's team sprawled around the dining table, laptops open, security footage playing on multiple screens. Martha watched from the doorway, invisible again, but by choice this time. Who knew the funeral details? Doran demanded. Location, timing, security protocols? Inner circle only, Victor replied, fingers flying across his keyboard. Family heads, your direct reports. Pull footage from the estate. 1 week before the funeral. Everyone who entered. They worked through the night. Martha brought coffee, stayed quiet, and observed. She saw Doran in full command, ruthless, brilliant, missing nothing. The pattern emerged slowly, then all at once. A woman appeared multiple times in the footage, someone who shouldn't have been there. Dark hair, expensive clothes, moving through the estate with the confidence of belonging. Isabella Caruso, Victor identified, freezing the frame. Antonio's daughter. Martha watched Doran's joy tighten. Antonio Caruso was an associate, handled East Side operations, and had been with Doran for 15 years. Keep looking, Doran ordered. More footage. Isabella meeting someone in the garden, heads bent close in conversation. The camera angle shifted, catching the man's face. Marco. One of Doran's inner circles. The man who'd been in charge of the funeral arrangements. Christo, Victor breathed. The plan crystallized with horrifying clarity. Fake Doran's death using a poison that mimicked it perfectly. Trigger chaos in the organization as everyone scrambled for power. In the vacuum of leadership, Isabella and Marco would position themselves to take control. She had her father's connections. He had internal authority. They'd have seized Doran's entire operation before anyone realized he was still alive. Martha's interruption destroyed the timeline, Doran said, his voice devoid of emotion. They couldn't let me be buried. They needed me alive for their plan to work. So they had paramedics ready. But her speaking up publicly forced them to actually save you, Victor finished. Expose their plot before they could consolidate power. Martha felt the weight of that truth settle over her. She'd saved Doran's life twice, once by speaking up and once by disrupting a coup. Doran planned his response with surgical precision over the following days. He arranged a meeting with Antonio Caruso, ostensibly to discuss territory disputes. Isabella would attend. She wouldn't be able to resist seeing the aftermath of her plan, watching Doran's organization fracture. Marco received a summons as well, unaware that he'd been exposed. Martha overheard the preparations through closed doors. Guns being checked. Backup teams positioned. Contingency plans for every possible scenario. She realized what was coming: violence, death, the inevitable conclusion of betrayal in this world. The night before the confrontation, Doran came to her room. "Tomorrow, you'll see who I really am," he said, standing in the doorway like a confession. "Not the man who asks about your books. The other one." Martha's voice was steady when she replied, surprising herself. "I've always known both existed." But she was terrified of what tomorrow would bring, and whether she'd still recognize herself after witnessing it. The meeting took place in a warehouse on the waterfront, the kind of location that appeared in crime documentaries and true crime podcasts. Martha recognized that immediately. "I'm coming with you," she'd told Doran that morning, her voice firm despite the fear coiling in her stomach. "No. If I'm part of this world, I need to see it." Martha stood her ground. "All of it." Doran studied her for a long moment, searching for something in her face. Then he nodded slowly. "No sheltering you from reality. Not anymore." The warehouse smelled of salt water and rust. Antonio Caruso and Isabella were already there when they arrived, flanked by their own security. Isabella wore designer clothes and boredom like armor, checking her phone with studied disinterest. Marco arrived separately, his nervousness palpable. He sensed something wrong. Martha could see it in how his eyes darted around the space, cataloging exits. The meeting began civilly enough. Discussion of territory, shipments, money. Doran played his role perfectly, the recovered boss, focused on business as usual. Then he shifted. "Let's discuss tetrodotoxin," Doran said casually, as if mentioning the weather. The room froze. Time seemed to crystallize around that single word. Isabella's face went completely blank, the boredom sliding off like a mask. Marco's hand moved instinctively toward his gun. Doran's men were faster. Marco was disarmed and forced his knees before his fingers touched metal, the crack of bone against concrete echoing through the warehouse. Antonio Caruso looked genuinely shocked, his weathered face draining of color. "What is this?" "Doran, I had no part in whatever." "I know," Doran interrupted, his voice calm. "But your daughter did." Isabella's composure finally cracked. "You were supposed to be buried," she hissed, abandoning all pretense. "You were supposed to stay dead." "Disappointing, isn't it?" Doran's smile was terrible. "When the dead refused to cooperate." Isabella bolted. She made it 3 steps before Victor materialized in her path, catching her by the arm and dragging her back like she weighed nothing. She fought, screaming, all elegance abandoned in favor of survival. Marco broke completely, words tumbling out in a desperate flood. The poison, I got it from a contact in Tokyo. Isabella planned everything, the timing, the paramedics. I just helped coordinate, I swear, it was her idea. Stop talking, Isabella snarled at him. But Marco couldn't stop, terror making him reckless. The paramedics were supposed to arrive after everyone left. We'd discover you still alive, but too late to save you. Make it look like medical incompetence. You helped bury me alive, Doran said quietly, cutting through Marco's babbling. Mercy doesn't exist for that. What happened next was brutal and efficient. Martha watched, unable to look away even as her stomach revolted. This wasn't movie violence, sanitized, choreographed, dramatic. This was real. The wet sound of impact, the smell of blood and fear, the undeniable finality of death. Doran demonstrated exactly what betrayal cost in his world. Antonio Caruso was spared. He'd known nothing, and his loyalty over 15 years counted for something. But he'd have to live knowing his daughter died screaming his name, begging him to save her. Isabella and Marco, their deaths were messages, warnings, lessons written in blood. Martha's hands shook violently. Ball rose in her throat. But she didn't close her eyes. This was the world she'd chosen by staying, and she forced herself to witness every terrible second. In the car afterward, silence pressed against them like a physical weight. Doran didn't apologize, didn't justify. He simply said, "Now you know." Martha nodded, incapable of words. Back at the estate, she went to her room, expecting to be alone with her horror. Instead, she found Doran waiting, standing by the window like a dark sentinel. "If you want to leave, I meant it," he said without turning. "I'll protect you from outside. You don't have to stay here." Martha thought about her options. Run back to invisibility, to serving coffee and collecting tips, to being nobody. Or stay in this dangerous light. She thought about the man who asked about her books and remembered her favorite flowers. And the man who'd killed without hesitation, without remorse. Both were real. Both were Doran. "I'm staying," Martha whispered, the words barely audible but absolute. Doran's expression shifted, surprise, relief, something deeper she couldn't name. "Then you need to understand, there's no halfway. You're all in or you're gone." Martha met his eyes, seeing her reflection in them, no longer invisible, no longer safe. "I know." And with those words, she crossed a line there's no returning from. Do you think she would regret it? 3 months after Isabella Caruso's body was found in the river, Martha stood in Doran's private study and said 5 words that changed everything. "I want to marry you." Doran looked up from the ledger he'd been reviewing, his expression shifting from concentration to complete shock. It was possibly the first time Martha had ever seen him truly caught off guard. "What?" "You heard me." Martha's heart hammered, but her voice stayed steady. "I want to marry you." He set down his pen with deliberate care. "I expected you to eventually leave, not this. I'm already yours in every way that matters." Martha moved closer, standing on the opposite side of his desk. "Make it official." "Martha, in your world, being your wife means something," she continued, the words she'd been rehearsing for days finally spilling out. "It means power, respect, voice. I don't want to just be protected. I want agency. I want to be your partner, not your kept woman." Doran stood, his expression serious in a way that had nothing to do with business. "It also means being a target forever. Every enemy I make becomes yours. Every war I fight. I became a target the moment I said you were breathing," Martha interrupted. "At least this way I have standing. I'm not just the woman you're protecting. I'm your wife. That means something in your world." He studied her for a long moment, and Martha saw him seeing her, really seeing the transformation. From an invisible waitress to a woman who understood power, who'd watched death and chosen to stay, who was proposing marriage to a monster. "Yes," Doran said finally. "But on one condition. You influence how I run things. Be my conscience when mine fails." The ceremony happened 2 weeks later in the mansion's garden. Intimate, private, attended by dangerous people who could topple governments with a phone call. Martha wore a dress that cost more than her childhood home, intricate lace and silk that transformed her completely. She stood beside a man who ruled through fear and spoke vows that were traditional in words, but revolutionary in meaning. She became Mrs. Moretti, both shield and target, both privilege and burden. The organization reacted with surprise, respect, and in some quarters, barely concealed resentment. But Doran made his position crystal clear in a meeting the day after the wedding. Disrespect to Martha was disrespect to him. The message was received. Martha began her influence carefully, feeling out the boundaries of her new power. Doran owned restaurants, legitimate fronts, but profitable. She suggested expanding into high-end hospitality, boutique hotels, real estate development. Give the family legal income streams, she explained over dinner one evening. Distance from the worst operations. Doran raised an eyebrow. You want to reform a criminal empire? I want to give it options. Martha met his gaze. Give people in your organization paths that don't end in prison or death. Their children shouldn't have to choose between poverty and crime. He was skeptical but intrigued. And you think luxury hotels will accomplish that? I think diversification accomplishes that. Legal money is still money. Slowly, changes began. Legitimate businesses expanded. Violent operations became more selective, strategic rather than reflexive. Martha attended meetings, offered perspectives, became the voice asking, "Is this necessary?" before blood was spilled. The organization didn't transform overnight, but it shifted incrementally toward something less purely destructive. 6 months into marriage, Martha realized she was pregnant. The news terrified her. Bringing a child into this world, this violent, dangerous world, felt impossible. She told Doran one evening, her hands shaking, expecting him to share her fear. Instead, his response was wonderful. "A daughter," he said immediately, his hand moving to her still flat stomach. "I want a daughter." His certainty surprised her. "How do you know it's a girl?" Doran smiled, genuinely smiled, something rare and precious. "Because if there's any justice, she'll be like you. Brave enough to speak the truth in rooms full of killers." Martha felt tears prick her eyes. He was already imagining protecting their child, giving her options he'd never had, raising her in this world without destroying her innocence. They began planning schools, security, how to give a child normalcy in an empire built on fear. As Martha's pregnancy progressed, she felt the final pieces of her old life fall away like shed skin. She wasn't the invisible waitress anymore. She was the wife of the most dangerous man in the city, carrying his child, wielding influence over an empire built on fear. And somehow, impossibly, she'd found love in the darkness. Their daughter was born on a Tuesday morning in March, and when Doran held her for the first time, Martha saw the most feared man in the city cry. The birth happened in a private hospital, the entire floor secured by Doran's men. Doctors who understood discretion, nurses who knew not to ask questions. Martha had labored through the night, Doran never leaving her side, his usual composure cracking with every contraction. Their daughter emerged with dark hair like Doran's and eyes that already seemed sharp, observant, Martha's eyes in a tiny face. "Sophia," Martha whispered, exhausted and euphoric. "Wisdom. Hoping she'll be wiser than either of us." Doran pressed his lips to Sophia's forehead, tears streaming unchecked down his face. "She already is." The first weeks were exhausting, beautiful, terrifying. Martha had expected Doran to retreat into work, to hire nannies and maintain distance. Instead, he was surprisingly hands-on, changing diapers at 3 in the morning, learning to swaddle, walking endless circles around the nursery to soothe Sophia's crying. Martha watched him transform. The violence didn't disappear, it never would, but it became compartmentalized. When he held Sophia, there was only gentleness. He was building something different for their daughter: protection without imprisonment, security without suffocation. The organization continued adapting. Legitimate businesses now generated 40% of revenue. The hotels Martha had pushed for were thriving, employing dozens of families with legal income. Real estate developments bore the Moretti name without bloodshed attached. Martha's influence had grown beyond anyone's expectations, including her own. She wasn't just Doran's wife anymore. She'd become a power broker, someone other families respected and sought out for counsel on disputes. She'd learned to navigate this world with the same skill that once made her invisible, knowing when to speak, when to stay silent, when to push. The violence still existed, it always would. But it was more strategic now, less casual. Bodies stopped appearing in rivers as frequently. Doran's reputation kept most conflicts from escalating. Martha had found her role. She wasn't reforming Doran, wasn't turning him into something he could never be. Instead, she was channeling his power towards something sustainable, something that might last beyond fear. One evening, Martha stood in Sophia's nursery, watching her daughter sleep. The soft rise and fall of that tiny chest, the perfect vulnerability of infancy. She thought about the woman who'd walked into that funeral 3 years ago. That Martha had been invisible, powerless, working herself to exhaustion just to survive. She'd served coffee to people who never learned her name, lived paycheck to paycheck, existed in the margins of other people's lives. This Martha had power, visibility, a voice that made dangerous men listen. But she was also complicit. She'd benefited from criminal enterprise, witnessed violence, kept silent about things that would horrify her younger self. The moral weight was real, undeniable. She hadn't transformed Doran into something good. Instead, she'd chosen him knowing exactly who he was, choosing darkness with open eyes. Her justification was that she'd made the empire more humane at the margins, created legitimate opportunities for families who might otherwise have no choice but crime. But she was still the wife of a crime lord, raising a child in a world built on fear. Rosa knocked softly, bringing tea. "You've changed him more than you know," she said quietly. Martha wasn't sure that was true, or if it even mattered. Doran found her there, wrapping his arms around her from behind. They watched Sophia together, this tiny life they'd created in the midst of chaos. "Do you regret it?" he asked quietly. "Speaking up that day?" Martha considered the question seriously. Her life could have continued in comfortable invisibility. She'd have remained powerless, unknown, safe in her insignificance. She'd never have witnessed death, never carried the weight of complicity, never crossed lines she couldn't uncross. "No," she finally said. "I don't regret it." Doran's response was barely a whisper. "You didn't just save my life. You gave me a reason to want to live it." Martha understood then. They'd saved each other in different ways. She'd given him purpose beyond power. He'd given her visibility beyond survival. Their love was dangerous, complicated, built on moral compromise. But it was also real, fierce, and protective, and absolutely certain. The world would call their story shocking, the waitress who stopped a funeral and married the man in the casket. But Martha knew the truth was more complicated than headlines. She'd made her choice with open eyes, walking into darkness, but carrying her own light. In a world built on fear and power, she'd found something else entirely, a love as dangerous as it was real, and a future she'd fight to protect with the same fierce courage that made her speak up when everyone else stayed silent. The world could call it shocking. Martha called it home.